It is my pleasure to welcome Jim Wilson to speak today on the history of the Point Lepreau Bird Observatory. Many of you already know that Jim has a long history as a birder and a naturalist in the Saint John area. But even more than that, he has spent decades volunteering his time, educating others about nature and nature conservation, especially through his efforts with the Point Lepreau Bird Observatory and the Saint John Naturalists Club. Um, I have known Jim since day one of joining the club about 8 years ago, and he's been like a mentor to me, and I've been so lucky to be able to work alongside him the last few years as the project coordinator. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, Jim, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. Good morning, everyone. All I have to do is put this up on the screen. All right. Okay. Well, a lot of the focus in the news and in the media is on Point Lepreau nuclear plant. But there's a lot more going on at Point Lepreau than just the nuclear plant. The plant is at the base of the Point Lepreau Peninsula, but out at the tip is another world altogether, where a lot of very interesting things happen, and it never makes the news. So let's go there and talk about what happens at Point Lepreau. Okay, the Point Lepreau Bird Observatory is a little building, and we do work with seabirds, sea ducks, and monarch butterflies. And as you can see on the left part of this slide, it's located at the very southern, in fact, it's almost one of the southernmost points of land in New Brunswick. If we look at it in the big pictures on the left, we can see where it sits on the Bay of Fundy, the North Shore. And then we look at the point, and we can see it extends out. It's about 3 kilometers in total out from the rest of the mainland shore. And if we look on the right part of this, the upper right, we can see that there's a lighthouse there with a little red circle around it. And to the left of that is the beginnings. This is an old picture of the actual Point Lepreau nuclear site. So in order to get there, you have to drive in from the main road, and then you have to go through security clearance, a security check, and receive a day pass, and then go on out the road that you can see that bisects the outer part of the point, out to and past the lighthouse to a little building, which you can see in the lower right of the screen, called the Point Lepreau Bird Observatory. Now, the story begins in April of 1995. David McCurdy was working at the plant. He was an engineer at the plant. He and I were friends. He was a member of the Saint John Naturalists Club. And at that time, there was no public access to the tip of the point. But he was able to get me some passage that evening. And late in the afternoon, we were standing at the tip of the point, excuse me, and there were thousands, literally, of sea ducks flying past. Now, these are common eiders, as an example. But there were also birds on the water, all kinds of scoters, black and surf scoter ducks, other eiders, and a myriad of things. And it was a very busy place. And in the background, ominously to us, to me, was a super tanker heading down from the Irving oil plant refinery at the head of the bay. So they were bringing in vast quantities of oil, unloading them there at the oil refinery, and then sailing past all of these birds. And it occurred to both of us at the time, what if there was an oil spill in the bay with all this activity, bird activity going on? And we kind of looked at one another and we said, if that were to happen, we would have no idea of how many birds might be affected. Obviously, it would be very negative, but right now this is frenetic here. It's just so many birds. Why don't we start to monitor them? Let's see how many birds there are, when they come through, what kinds, etc. And that information, at the very least, would be invaluable in the event of an oil spill, to see what the impact might be on bird populations passing through the Bay of Fundy. So by September, this is Dave, he had opened up some doors at Point Lepreau so that we could get some security clearance for a few people. And we had permission through the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, which owns the tip of the point, federal land, to put a little building on there. We actually eventually had have a license to put that building there and maintain it on a 5-year rotating basis. So here we are, September 29th, 1995, ready to pour a little concrete base and get on with the construction. Now, we brought into the picture several club members of the day. Now, that's Dave right in the center of the picture. But on the left is Bill Nowlin, who is a neighbor of ours and a member of the club. In behind is one of the founding members of the Saint John Naturalists Club, Lloyd Foster. And then on the right is Phil Withers, who became pivotal in this whole thing. And we didn't have any money. All we had was $100 that had been donated by the New Brunswick Federation of Naturalists at the time. And with good wishes, good luck with the project, etc. And so with that $100, we were able to get some plywood. And Phil Withers, there on the right, the greatest scrounger in the world. And he was perfect for the job because he loved to do this kind of stuff. And he was a great scrounger, as they say. So we managed to get some cheap plywood, some old boards, and we started to build a little shelter that we're going to transport down to the tip of the point eventually. Now, this is October. So moving on a month, we now had the building down there. We had it on a little cement pad, and we're putting shingles on it in late middle of November, one of the coldest November days I can ever remember. And so we have the guys there. There's Ross Mavis on the left, Dick Nelson on the middle, and Phil, and then Frank Withers, Phil's brother. These are all members of the club, and we're wonderful getting this off the ground. So we figured that fall, looking forward to the next spring, we had it made because we now have a shelter, keep the wind off, because it's a very windy spot down there and very cold. And we had openings in the front for viewing of all the birds that we expected to come. So this was great. We didn't need anything more. We didn't think. However, the following spring, there was no heat in the place, and we started monitoring in March, the middle of March. March and April can be really cold no matter what, and out there it's even worse. So spring 1996, no heat, no insulation in the building, and no glass in the windows. We pretty near froze because we were down there for a 4-hour count. And by the time 4 hours was over, you could hardly make it to the car. We were so cold. So we insulated it, we put some windows in it, but we still didn't have any heat. So we managed to start using a propane heater, which wasn't great for the next couple of years. But Phil was on the case, and he started working with the people at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans because the lighthouse was there. And Phil figured if we could get them to cooperate, we could get some cable, we could bury it. And the guys, he finally did, convince them to bore a hole through the concrete wall of the lighthouse. We ran our wire in through there, and one of their electrical people hooked it up and ran it out to our observatory. We buried it, and then we had a single plug that we could plug an electric heater into. This is 2 years in the making. But good old Phil, he finally made it happen. So that was great. We had that, and our little building had a little bit of heat. We had it closed in and insulated, and we used that little building, which could only hold maybe 3 people, from 1996 was the first year we started observing in the spring, to 2017, like 21 or 22 years. That's what we used, with a single little plug and a little heater that kept us from freezing to death. So that was fine. We collected a lot of data, which was the intent, 20 some years at that point, and we built a growing relationship with NB Power at the nuclear plant. They're extremely cooperative. They helped us with a protocol to get everybody who wanted to volunteer security clearance. They allowed us to come in, get a day pass, and go on out to the observatory. You couldn't ask for better cooperation. And so one of the things that was discussed from time to time is the smallness of our building. So NB Power said, okay, we think we can help. So they had a crew along with some of our volunteers, and the building began to double. And this went on in the summer of 2017. The building was doubled. Some construction materials was supplied, and we ended up with their carpenters assisting with a custom-built, fantastically good building for exactly what we want to do. Monitor seabirds coming up the Bay of Fundy in both spring and in fall. And it now will hold 4 people comfortably, and we now have a marvelous 8 plugs in there with a new electrical connection. You couldn't ask for more. This is what it looks like inside. We have wonderful glass in the front windows, and the windows on the front windows are on the right. The windows on the left are the old windows. They're in the back of the building that we used to have in the front of the smaller one. And we kept the door because the door was one of Phil's real scrounge prizes. He got it at a junkyard. It came from a sauna. And so we thought, well, we have to have a little bit of nostalgia because Phil had passed away. And that door is still there in his memory in the observatory. So, in great shape. So there's our Point Lepreau Observatory today, right at the tip of the point with a 270-degree view of the sea and the birds that come north in spring and go back south in the fall pass pretty close to the tip, excuse me, of the point in their migrations. So the other great thing is we have security, of course, that's at the base of the point. Nobody can get at the tip of the point without going through that area and getting security clearance. So there's no vandalism of our building. And the other great thing is security has to make their rounds year round, 24/7. So they plow the road to the tip of the point and to our observatory, right to the door, winter, and it's always available in the summer. We couldn't ask for a more cooperative situation and a more strategic location. So the big question, why is this project important? And why is Point Lepreau so strategic a spot? Well, you kind of already know part of that, I guess, but let's delve into it a little bit. The birds that we're seeing, and we had no idea why they were there when they came. Remember, we just knew there was a pile of them came through, and that we wanted to get data in case there was an oil spill. Well, it turns out, and we've sort of learned this over the 30 years or so, the sea ducks and seabirds that we're talking about winter from literally the Maine coast, even parts of the lower Bay of Fundy, all the way down the eastern seaboard to Florida and perhaps even the Gulf Coast in some cases, but the majority from, say, Georgia, northern Florida, all the way up to Maine. Now, these birds are at sea and they're diving birds. They feed by diving to the bottom and getting their food. And in the springtime and the summer, they move up to nest. The majority of them, these are the sea ducks at least, which are the majority, in the vastness of the eastern Arctic, really from eastern Manitoba all the way over to Labrador and all the way up pretty much actually to the tip of Labrador. So here's where they are in the summer, spread out over a myriad of ponds and lakes up that area. Here they are in the winter, here, spread out over a vast area of sea. So how does the U.S. and the Canadian Wildlife Service have a way to monitor these birds, their populations? They can maybe make estimates, but the only way they had before what we're doing and one other location on the eastern seaboard is doing was to fly aircraft along the coast in the wintertime and try to count those little specks down on the water, which are underwater half the time, and try to figure out what species they are and how many they are, etc. And it's very expensive. In the summertime, they're remote. They're away from anywhere where most people could be and spread out over a vast distance. However, you'll note that the wintering area and the summering area right here, just north of the wintering area, is little old Point Lepreau and the yawning jaws of the Bay of Fundy. It turns out that when these birds start moving north to go here, most of them tend to follow the coast and come all the way up, and the Bay of Fundy begins to act as a funnel, and Point Lepreau sticks out there to kind of intercept them in a sense. And as they're flying north, they tend to sort of go just shave the tip of the point and then go from there on up through to the Northumberland Strait, and then from there on up to the eastern Canadian Arctic. And when they come through the Bay of Fundy, and remember the funneling effect of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick coasts, we have offshore islands, Whitehead, and particularly Graminan Island, and it appears that a lot of this flow goes along the coast and is deflected sort of inward a little bit by these offshore islands. They sometimes seem to go out beyond that. We know the vast majority go inside. Point Lepreau is here. They fly past the point. We can see them. And then they go right on up to the head of the bay, cross over the isthmus, over to the Summerland Strait, and then on up and further north. A lot of them actually congregate in the Chaleur Bay, actually in the spring too, before moving on. But Point Lepreau is uniquely, as we turns out and we find, it's a critical point for seeing these birds and counting them. And we have the location and the building to enable people to do it. So what are we seeing? Over the 30 years, it's we are only counting, we're only there 4 hours on average each morning and 4 hours each afternoon. And the protocol we adopted from Birds Canada and the Canadian Wildlife Service at the very beginning, and we've stuck with that all the way to be consistent, is to count for 15 minutes and then take a rest and then count for 15 more and take a rest, etc., for 4 hours. So we're actually only counting 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours during an afternoon shift of 4 hours. So all we're getting our numbers is that small fraction of time, even though it's a sampling, that the birds are flying really potentially 24 hours a day. So based on what we've counted over the 30 years about 1.7 million birds. But that's only 2 or 4 hours of each 24-hour day during the migration period. So if you extrapolate that, we're into many millions of birds that pass through every year through the Bay of Fundy. Black scoter, which is a sea duck, is 52% on average of our annual spring bird traffic. Surf scoter, a related species, 25%. So we're now up to 77% of all the birds we've counted have been of 2 species. Common eider, 14% over all those years of our annual spring volume. Long-tailed duck, a beautiful duck that nests in the northern tundra, 3% of our annual volume. Loons, 3%. Red-throated loons are 3% of our annual spring volume. That's supposed to be spring. That's a spring plumaged red-throated loon on the left and a winter plumaged or immature bird on the right. White-winged scoter, another member of the 3 scoters, 2% of our annual volume. So we're now up to about 98% of the birds we see are something in the order of 6 or 7 species. Also, at the tip of the point, during the fall and the winter, are a species at risk called the harlequin duck. Found very few places where you can reliably go and see these, and probably nowhere else on the mainland of New Brunswick. You have to go to some of the offshore islands in the winter to find this species. So that's significant as well. And we have a group, sometimes as many as 25, that winter at the tip of Point Lepreau, right beside and in front of our observatory. Purple sandpiper, excuse me, the only sandpiper that winters in Canada regularly, and most of the Canadian purple sandpipers are thought to winter in the Bay of Fundy. And we have sometimes up to 500 that are there around the point. Double-crested cormorants, very widespread bird during summer, migrating south in the fall, coming back in the spring. We get quite a few of those coming through, especially in the fall at Point Lepreau. Razorbills, they're a relative of the Atlantic puffin, are off the point in spring and in the winter. And we sometimes have groups of there, several hundreds. Loons again, common loon pass through. And just to put loons into perspective, between red-throated loon that you saw earlier and common loon, we have counted as many as 10,000 2 years ago during the month of May coming through, and 13,000 in the spring of 2025 coming through. So there's huge volumes of some of these birds. If there was an oil spill, imagine the effect on eastern seabird and sea duck populations at the wrong time, especially. So at the forefront of all of this, particularly since 2016 and up to the present, Todd Watts, who lives in Quebec, is an exceptional observer and counter, great skills. And Todd is our chief official counter from about the latter part of March until the early part of May. We contract him to be our official counter. And also for the afternoons, Paul Martin is our official counter starting last year and going forward. Our financial history, just to give you a perspective on that, the total estimated value of this project over the 30 years, and this is only involving the sea duck and seabird work, is about $763,000, made up of grant monies, principally of about 230,000 over the 30 years, and volunteer contributions, conservatively valued at $20 an hour, and more recently 25, is another $533,000. The principal thing that's really important here is to see that our volunteer contributions contributed about 70% of the value to this project. So volunteers have been huge. We have a huge debt of appreciation to our volunteers, and cash from various grants and other sources, 30%. That's very significant if you're applying for funding when you've got that level of volunteer involvement and engagement. So total security cleared volunteers over the 30 years, well, on the average on the list, was about 340 people. That's a lot of volunteers. The active volunteers on site annually varies from 30 to 35 in recent years, but it's kept the project going very healthily. We've had a number of publications using PLBO data over the 30 years. There's been an honors thesis. There's been one on trends in migration rates up to 2005, published in the Brunswick Federation of Naturalists. There's been another one done in waterbirds. There's a prestigious publication on birds worldwide. There's been a couple of presentations there. There's been a publication of radar observations, some experimentary work to see if radar could pick up on seabirds and sea ducks passing at night or beyond the ability of us to see further out in the bay. That was done in 2010 with Acadia University. There's another one, an update on rates of species and population trends in 2012, an honors thesis in 2015, a master's in 2019, and then another in 2020 with the master's student and his professor at UNBSJ. So we have quite a bit, but we need to have some more in the next while because obviously time's marching on and we should have an update. We've also developed for this, and this is created by Julie Bauer, who's right here, a beautiful logo for our project, Point Lepreau, established 1995, our bird observatory, and you can see our little building there and the lighthouse. So that's a bit of a quick overview, and I know there'll be some questions because I kind of skimmed over it, of the seabird project, seabird, sea duck part of the project. But we can now go back, fast forward back a bit to the autumn of 2004. Sitting there and looking at the seabird migration in the early part of the fall. We do some checking of seabirds passage in the fall, but in the fall with seabirds, there isn't the same funneling effect and the same massive migration in a short span of time. The birds come out of the Arctic and they go to the coast sort of in a direct line from the various locations they've summered. And so it's sort of a shotgun pattern, and we don't get as nearly as many seabirds in the fall. But we do monitor just to make some comparisons to the spring. And while there, in September, I began to notice that there were monarch butterflies flying past the observatory. And, you know, if you're not looking for them, you don't really notice it. But over time, a pattern began to appear that there was quite a few monarchs. And so I thought, well, I pay attention to that. And as it turned out, around the same time, Jean and I, my wife, were down in Cape May, New Jersey, and they were tagging monarch butterflies there. And there was a workshop. So we decided we would attend. And we did, and we learned that the tagging of monarchs is to do with monarch conservation and in the attempt to try and identify the paths of migration, pathways that monarch butterflies use to get from southern Canada to Mexico each autumn, where they spend the winter and then come back up to the United States and eventually Canada in the summer. So I became interested in it. I thought, well, let's bring this tagging to Point Lepreau. Let's see how many monarchs are around. As it turned out, what we thought was a trickle is much more than that, but it's pretty insignificant unless you're paying attention to it. I went outside after I realized that monarchs were around, and I walked over to the little thistle patch that's right beside the observatory, and I found a monarch, just like this one, on a thistle. And it was probing its proboscis, which is this little feeding tube right here, into the plant and was really engaged. And I reached down and I was actually able to pick it up by the folded wings. And I looked at it and began to examine it. And I realized the monarch butterfly is a much more robust butterfly than anything I've ever seen before. Almost the wings have almost little bones in them. And I became fascinated by that connection and decided we should start tagging monarchs. And we now know that that little thistle patch, which is there in the foreground in this, Point Lepreau is now the largest known migration monarch staging area during fall migration in all of New Brunswick. At least that's known. So I get thinking, why is that? Why, just like the ducks, why are so many monarchs coming down to Point Lepreau? But I didn't appreciate how unique that was. So why is it so strategic? Well, if we look at the map of New Brunswick and we see where Point Lepreau is, we know where it is, right there at the southern part on the Bay of Fundy. I thought, well, every headland, because it's a point, the monarchs are funneling out on it, and that's probably why. So they probably funnel out on all the points in New Brunswick. So I started asking birders, what about Miscou Island, Ile Lemec, Shippagan, maybe Bay St. Anne, maybe any of these points, even here at Cape Tormentine, maybe even at Alma, maybe even here at Saint John. Along here, there's Cape Spencer. How many monarchs are you guys seeing? And every one of them came back and said, we don't see monarchs at all, hardly ever. We just don't see them. It's a rare sight. And I said, are you sure? Yeah. Oh, yeah, we're around. We're there quite a lot. It's notable when we see a monarch butterfly. Well, why would Point Lepreau have so many? So in reading the literature about monarchs, their migration patterns can be to follow mountain ranges, major highways, coastlines, and also major river valleys. So I get thinking, well, look at the map. Point Lepreau is along the coastline, but south and southwest, which is the direction monarchs are likely to travel, to the Saint John River Valley. Could that be the major conduit that takes them from the center of the province, those that reproduce on milkweed in the center of the province, down to us? They hit the coast, they go in the direction that instinctively they're flying, and they come to the Point Lepreau. Well, perhaps that's it. Well, look around down there, and it's a garden of blooming plants with nectar, and the monarchs are coming along the coast. They find that at the tip of the point. They need to fuel up for the next leg of migration, which could be out over the water. And so they find exactly what they need at exactly the right time at the tip of the point in the abandoned fields. We have asters, we have goldenrods, and we have those very important thistle plants that have lots and lots of nectar. So that was the theory for quite a while. I kind of thought it probably had a lot to do with it. Well, we now know that is in fact the case, because we are always watching at Point Lepreau for tagged monarchs from other places. And we have caught now 2 different monarchs tagged above Fredericton in the Saint John River Valley by the same person that tags every year. And we caught them down here at Point Lepreau. We've also caught some that were tagged in the Hampton and Quispamsis area on the Kennebecasis River system, and they came down and ended up at Point Lepreau as well. So we know that this area is bringing monarchs to us for sure. And they follow the coast. And then from Point Lepreau, we watch them fly over the water all the way toward Grand Manan. And we've had people on Grand Manan find and photograph our tagged monarchs. So we've already discovered the flow of monarchs through our tagging that comes out of New Brunswick to Point Lepreau. We know it goes on out for the most part to Grand Manan, and then folks have seen them flying from Grand Manan on down to the coast of Maine, and then on from there, presumably further on down, and then they cut inland across North America and go on toward Mexico. So our little tagging job has already mapped out the monarch flow largely from New Brunswick, which is really cool. What is this tagging project? We've talked about why it's done, but it's sponsored by Monarch Watch, which is the University of Kansas entomology department. They provide numbered adhesive wing tags. It's a special adhesive, non-toxic, to attach the wing tag to a butterfly. There's an online database for matching butterfly tagging data and subsequent sightings. So we send in at the end of the season all our information about the tag number, etc. And then if someone else reports that they saw it down in, I don't know, New Jersey or somewhere in Texas, then it gets matched and we know our butterfly made it to there. The Mexicans at the sites that they winter in Mexico are paid $5 for each tag that can be recovered down there. So why do we tag monarch butterflies? Well, I kind of already disclosed that actually. It's an attempt to try to map out over time, little pins on the map with these recoveries, the migration routes that the monarchs take from southern Canada down to where they winter. Now, the general distribution of monarch butterflies in Canada is about the limit of the plant that they have to lay their eggs on in order to reproduce, milkweed. And milkweed grows across the land, across southern Canada, and just about its limit at the Saint John River Valley in New Brunswick, interestingly enough. And so they would leave, presumably New Brunswick, cut down along the coast, and then maybe go inland here, or even some of them go into Florida, to some of the Caribbean islands, to the Yucatan, and then eventually all the ones east of the Rockies would end up, theoretically anyway, in the mountains here in the neo-volcanic belt of mountains in Mexico. That's a lot of butterflies, millions. I'll come back to that later because Jean and I were there in 2007. So that's the purpose of tagging monarch butterflies. So we're into it. The tags are little small tags. They come on a sheet like stamps, like postage stamps in a way. Each tag is less than a centimeter in diameter, just big enough to fit on the wing of a butterfly. It has information about monarchwatchtag.org, a website, Monarch Watch, the name of the project, and then each tag has a unique four-letter, three-digit identification. So the series is AP, looking at the upper left, APBB, ABPB 075, the next one is 76, 77. So they're sequential. So we send to the University of Kansas, we buy the tags, the money goes toward maintaining their system, and we apply the tags to monarchs based on instructions that they provide. And the tag goes on what's called a discal cell. Right here, it looks like a little mitten on the hind wing, which is, they have four wings and hind wings. On the hind wing, and that's where the tag goes, so that when the butterfly's on a plant somewhere down the line, somebody can see it, photograph it, or get the numbers off it and report. So what do we record with the tagging data when we're at Point Lepreau? Well, it's evolved over time, remembering that we started this around 2006, and we're now 2026. So we've been at it for 20 years. We now record the tag number on a sheet, date and location tagged, which would be Point Lepreau. The monarch weight. We went to the drug dealers and we bought some, not really, bought some very small scales, and we look at any physical damage. We have a code for that. If there's none, it's a 0. If we have lots, it's a 2 or 3. Wing length from tip to base and the sex of the monarch, male or female. The data also looks at, and we look under a microscope, for the presence of Ophrocystis electrocera, which is OE for short. It's a parasite protozoa that the butterflies sometimes pick up from the plants that they're feeding on, and it can weaken the butterfly. So we record that and we look for it on the butterfly in each one we tag and record it because we want to see if it makes a difference to those that make it to Mexico. Big picture. Then we also, if the monarch was raised in captivity or if it was wild. In other words, some people raise them in captivity and want to put a tag on them. or was it a wild one caught at Point Lepreau? And the ones that we tag down there are all wild, of course. So there's a tag butterfly. You can see the net that we catch it in. This is inside the building. All that data has been recorded. The tag is on. We're going to take it outside and we're going to release it on the same bunch of plants, group of plants that we caught it on, so we can go back to nectaring before it goes on the next stage of its journey. And most of them will go back to nectaring. This is it. Bon voyage, destination Mexico, and we've tagged, in the 20 years we've been tagging, 5,200 monarch butterflies at Point Lepreau. That's not an incidental number for little old New Brunswick, because we're at the limit of where monarchs are reproduced. We've had some pretty important guests, and we've had a lot of people down tagging, including people at the plant, but also we had the Lieutenant Governor in 2017 who heard about our project and wanted to come down. Honorable Jocelyn Roy Vigneault and her husband, Ron. And you can see we had a real day of it. The kids from the local school came. We had folks from the plant, the nuclear plant. Her Honor and her husband made a tour of the nuclear plant. Her security entourage was there with her, came down to the tip of the point, and she tagged a monarch and was delighted. You can look at a look of delight on anybody that tags a monarch. That physical contact that I mentioned that I enjoyed way years before, it's powerful, very powerful. So that was the first VIP we had, and then the subsequent. This would be Honorable Brenda Murphy, Lieutenant Governor, and her partner Linda Boyle. They made a trip in 2020, and again went through the same plant tour. We had an entourage of our people from our club. I think we had some local folks as well, and it was a very nice celebratory day, and it was really a very interesting time. And you'll notice that Her Honor is wearing a butterfly mask on that day. We'll also have some folks in the plant, some people, these are folks for the most part from the nuclear plant, and every one of them has delight. There's delight there. This is a real special thing. You put a tag on, you're about to put it back on the plant, and you're going to release it and hope it makes it to Mexico, or hope somebody sees it along the way to give us more information. These are all photographs by Kathleen Dugay at MB Power, who's a real champion of this project. We've also hosted all three Indigenous groups. Julie made mention of Indigenous. This is one of the Mi'kmaq elders. She comes down most years. You'll notice that she's appropriately attired. She's got a pair of monarch earrings on, and she has monarch fingernails. And the Indigenous, all three Indigenous groups are very, very appreciative of the opportunity to work with monarchs. And it's a very emotional event for them to tag a monarch. Very often, you'll find that they will want to dedicate that monarch to a person in their family who might have passed on or is ill or sick. And they take great, very, very emotional strength in that symbolic act of putting a tag on and sending the monarch on its way. And so they've been coming down the Wooster-Quay, Mi'kmaq, and Pescatomakati, and we've tagged monarchs with each of them more than once, more than 1 year, and really welcome them to come back because it's special. And interesting enough, I had no idea, but these are two Mi'kmaq elders. The gentleman on the right is a significant elder with the monarch, or with the Mi'kmaq, Tully Paul, and the girl on the right, Helen Ward, is a drummer. She's a member of a drum group. And you'll notice that they are wearing an emblem on their chest, and they presented me completely unknown. I had no idea it was coming, with one with our Point Lepreau logo on it, in recognition of the significance to them of this Point Lepreau project and the tagging of monarchs. So I was blown away, as they don't do this very often. So we tagged monarch for each and released. So that was pretty special, I'll tell you. Anyway, coming back and closing out, we're almost done. Jean and I were lucky enough to be able to go with a group of friends to the monarch sanctuaries in Mexico in 2007 in the winter when the butterflies were wintering down there in March, and they were starting to wake up and get ready to migrate north to eventually southern Canada. And this is a picture I took. There were estimated 70 million monarch butterflies on that mountaintop. The mountaintop was called El Rosario, and we also visited Chinqua, which is another mountaintop. There are 12 mountaintops there, and each one of them annually hosts millions of monarchs. So that was a very, very emotional experience for us too, to be able to go down there and see that. Well, we tag every year. And in 2012, this is a picture of a monarch butterfly tag that was recovered from El Rosario, which is where Jean and I had been, one of the mountaintops, in 2007. We had put it on at Point Lepreau, Rat 935. There was a different, smaller digital numbers then. And it was tagged on the 30th of August, 2012, and recovered in Mexico that winter. There it is. And this is a certificate from the Monarch Watch project down at the University of Kansas. Tag code RAT 935. It was tagged at Point Lepreau. It was picked up by one of the Mexican people, the workers there, at the El Rosario on February 27th of the following winter. It traveled a straight line, 4,251 kilometers, 2,642 miles, direct, and then that's an estimate on the map, Google, I guess, from Point Lepreau to where it was found in south central Mexico. And we had a second one that winter as well. It was a big die-off of monarchs, unfortunately, there, and that's how they came to find the tag on the ground on the dead monarchs. Kind of sad, but it also indicates that some of our monarchs do make it to Mexico. And when they're gathered on the trees in big clumps there, the workers are not allowed to bother them or touch them at all. So many of our tags would be there unnoticed unless something happened to the butterfly and the butterfly fell to the ground. At least we had 2 tags recovered. And those are the only 2 so far, but very significant, particularly to Jean and I, because we were there. So we've been at both ends of it. And I have the name of the Mexican gentleman that found the tag. And if we ever get back there, I'm going to try and look him up because he'd be local there. And if he's still living, shake his hand and say, look, this tag, you wouldn't remember it, but we sure do. And thank you very much. So we're just about done. We've got a couple more slides. This is a graph of the estimated numbers wintering in those areas in Mexico. There are 12 sites. There's aerial photographs carefully taken by the World Wildlife Fund and a couple of other organizations. An estimate of the number of hectares of forest covered with orange monarchs is done every year. And back in 1995, 96, when we first started our observatory, back at that time, so 96, 97, there was 18 hectares and that's billions of monarch butterflies, square hectares of forest covered by them. But it's gone down steadily ever since, and it's down to less than 1 hectare and rebounded this past year or so a little bit. And it's still very, very low. So we've lost, here we are. We've lost about 90% of monarch butterflies that might have been at the highest point. The reasons for this are varied. There's a number of them. I don't have time to articulate them here, but one of the big ones is a lack of milkweed in some of the areas where in southern U.S. where when they come back into the U.S. because they can't find milkweed in Mexico, it's too arid, but they need milkweed, those wintering butterflies, because their life is coming to an end in April. They've lived that length of time, but they're going to die, and they have to find monarch or milkweed to put their eggs on before they pass away. And a lot of that milkweed is now killed by spraying of crops, which is would be corn or I guess soybean maybe, in the vast areas of Texas and Louisiana where those crops are grown. They're spraying and killing the milkweed as an incidental weed and keeping the crops because there's genetically modified seed. So as a result, we're trying to make an effort in New Brunswick when they come back north to spread the number of monarch friendly plants, swamp milkweed and common milkweed, through a seed program that we have. Julie mentioned that at the very beginning. Anyway, so right now monarchs are in deep trouble, but we're trying to work to try to make the situation better as a lot of other organizations. So let's move to the project's major partners to wrap this up. Birds Canada provided the original counting methodology, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 4 hours in duration. Canadian Wildlife Service advice on counting methods, ongoing major financial support. DFO, that's Department of Fisheries and Oceans, permission and granting a license to have our building on its land. Environment Canada granted permit to tag monarchs because monarchs are now a species at risk on federal lands, and you need a permit in order to be tagged them, and we have that. Plus online publishing of our seabird and sea duck count data. New Brunswick Power, security clearance, building improvements, strong project support for both projects. New Brunswick Wildlife Trust Fund, Environmental Trust Fund, Ducks Unlimited Canada, Nature New Brunswick for present and past financial support. And then Saint John UNB, master's research student, evaluation of our count methodologies and our procedures. You had that gone through with them. So we have a lot of partners and a lot to be thankful for this project. Point Lepreau Bird Observatory, tip of Point Lepreau, not making the news, but a pretty significant project, 30 years and counting.
Thank you again, Jim, on behalf of the club, for being with us today and for the many years that you've given to bird conservation, monarch butterflies, education, all of that. It has been amazing to hear the story. So with that, we will say goodbye.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.